Good morning, everybody. This week we're looking at two different stories. Our Old Testament reading is the end of the book of Job. It's the part when, having argued with God, been frustrated with God, Job rebuilds his relationship with God, is restored to fullness of body and soul. And in a similar way, in today's Gospel reading, the blind beggar Bartimaeus is restored to sight and to fullness of body, mind, and soul. Last week we had the disciples struggling to understand who Jesus is and what he was trying to teach them, jockeying for power. Despite having followed Jesus throughout the land, they are spiritually blind to what is happening around them. They may be walking with Jesus, but they don't know him or understand him. In contrast to them, Bartimaeus, hearing that Jesus is on the way, puts himself out there. He's heard of Jesus. He knows that in Jesus lies his hope for the future. He doesn't spend time questioning if he's worthy or who Jesus is or how he's doing things. Bartimaeus refuses to be defined by his circumstances or by the expectations of those who are able to see, those who appear to be close to Jesus, and who even presume the right to speak on Jesus' behalf. Rather than trust others, Bartimaeus trusts himself and persists until his call is heard by Christ. He knows and believes that in Jesus lies his future. Even before Jesus restores his sight, Bartimaeus sees and he understands in a way that the disciples do not. Job, in a similar way, refuses to abandon his belief in God, despite the naysayers he meets. He refuses to listen to those who presume to speak of God, but they speak of a God who does not match the God that Job knows. Out of that persistence in speaking to God, ultimately comes wholeness and restoration. From the faith of Job, from the faith of Bartimaeus, come that wholeness and restoration. But how? How did Job get from suffering to wholeness? How did Bartimaeus get from begging to healing? How come they were restored when it seems as though so many we know aren't? What did they have that we don't? What Job and Bartimaeus learnt is that transformation and restoration start from within ourselves. It takes standing back and examining ourselves piece by piece. It takes searching for God in the midst of the darkest times, looking for gleams of hope in that darkness. In the middle of his grief and despair, his questioning, Job clings fast to God. He brings who he is before God, and in the encounter, in the search, in the seeking, God reveals more of himself, and in doing so, more of God. It isn't talking to God which changes him, but being in God's presence. Job says, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." Bartimaeus, similarly, hears of Christ through the stories of others. Those stories excite him enough to put in the effort to meet with Christ himself, and he sees. Often we know of God through others, through what they say, through their experience and their encounters with God. And there is nothing wrong with that in itself. But the stories we tell ought to encourage others to seek out God themselves. The stories we listen to should light a fire within, which burns to experience for ourselves personal encounter with God. Restoration, healing, and wholeness does not come second-hand, but through personal relationship with God. For Job, his deepened experience of God summons him to new ways of seeing, leads him outside of himself, and creates of him a new being in the midst of his community. The change in Job, if you follow the story, leads to a change in his community. Likewise, in the story of Bartimaeus and his restoration to full health, this leads to a community which seeks out Jesus, which urges people towards Jesus. The persistence of Bartimaeus and Job, their encounters with God, the restoration to health of body, mind, and spirit, restores not only themselves, but changes how the community views God. What do we need restoring? What needs healing in our lives? How are we approaching God? Are we doing that through the faith of others or through our own faith? And how can our faith help to open up a vision of God which others want to seek? These are the questions that face us, and this is a calling that we are called to follow. Amen.